Types of market structure. Here we're going to discuss perfect competition. Later we will discuss monopoly. These are two ends of the spectrum of how would we describe different types of market structure. If we would like to break down different types of market structure a little bit further, we could describe 4 different types of market structure. So at one end of our spectrum, we have our perfect competition. That's what we're going to talk about now. At the other end of our spectrum, we have a pure monopoly. Okay? A monopoly describes when there is only one firm in a marketplace. Okay? The opposite of that, perfect competition, there are very many firms in a marketplace. In between these two ends of our spectrum, we could describe market structures as being monopolistic competition. That is where there are many different firms. Similar to perfect competition, the freedom of entry is unrestricted, but the nature of the product that is being traded in monopolistic competition is differentiated. That means that each firm is selling a different product, not something that you could swap exactly one for another. Okay, so an example of that might be an iPhone compared to an Android phone. You could compare them, but they are differentiated. They're not exactly the same. In perfect competition, the product that we're talking about is typically homogeneous. Homogeneous means that the product sold by one firm is identical to the products sold by another firm, pretty much. The example of different types of vegetables might be a good example. One farmer selling cabbages is competing with other farmers selling cabbages, and it's very difficult to distinguish between the cabbages from one farmer and another farmer. So we can say that these products are undifferentiated, so they're not different from each other. Okay. Further towards the extreme of a pure monopoly, we have an example of an oligopoly. Okay, an oligopoly has more than one firm in that marketplace, so there are a few firms. Okay, but the competition is less because there's only a few firms. So typically the reason there's only a few firms is that the freedom of entry might be restricted. So an example of that might be your phone network providers. You could have a choice of maybe 3 different firms, but a lot of their pricing plans tend to resemble each other. And that's because there isn't a massive amount of competition between them. That could be described as an oligopoly. Okay. Then later on, so we're going to talk about the two extremes in more detail. Now we're going to talk about perfect competition. Later on, we're going to talk about a pure monopoly. Okay. In a pure monopoly, as we've mentioned, there's only one firm. And again, it's because freedom of entry into that market is either highly restricted or completely blocked. And it could be completely blocked by practicality reasons, like for example, with your electricity company, it would be very difficult for another company to set up the infrastructure required to deliver the power to your house. They would need to put in a lot of wires and cabling all the way up to your house. Yeah? Or it could be restricted by law. So oftentimes there might be a state monopoly for certain services. So an example here is the local water company. You only have IWA to work with. It's not competing with other firms. Okay. So we're going to talk in more detail about perfectly competitive markets. Okay, and they're characterized by having no barriers to entry. So that is that anyone can set up and start trading relatively quickly and cheaply in that marketplace. Again, our example of cabbages. If anybody wants to grow cabbages, they can sell those cabbages. So here we have some nice pictures of some perfectly competitive markets. You can see Bahrain's vegetable market here, and you can see Bahrain's fish market down here. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself, the sellers in these markets, are they price makers? Do they get to determine what the price will be? Or are they price takers? Do they have to accept what is the going price for that good? Okay, so in the example of a perfect competition market example, do the sellers make the price, or do they have to accept what the price is? Are they price takers? So the sellers in a perfectly competitive market, they must take the price that is determined by the market forces of supply and demand. So we've mentioned before the supply curve and the demand curve, and we've mentioned that they tend to form an equilibrium where the quantity supplied will equal to the quantity demanded, and that equilibrium will determine the equilibrium price. So sellers in a perfectly competitive market will have to accept that market equilibrium price. Now, because the price is determined by the market, if we then look at an individual firm's or an individual seller's demand curve, what we will find is that the demand curve is perfectly elastic. So what does that mean? It means that the price is essentially fixed for that individual firm. And that's because an individual firm is not going to output a significant enough quantity to the total market in order to move the price up or down. So no matter how much they output, it's still small compared to the total marketplace. So one seller of cabbages, if they withdraw all of their cabbages from the marketplace, or if they add a large number for them of cabbages into the marketplace, it's not going to move the market price because there are very, very many sellers of cabbages. Okay, so this perfectly elastic demand curve looks like a flat line where the price is fixed for any quantity which is demanded of that firm's product. So for example, for one farmer, no matter how many cabbages they sell, they're just getting the market price. Okay, so this flat line of the demand curve is also the average revenue curve and the marginal revenue curve. Remember, the average is the revenue per unit sold. So essentially the revenue per unit sold is just going to be the price that the unit is sold at. So it's just a constant. The marginal revenue is the revenue of the next unit sold. So again, it's also just constant. So these three things are all the same. They're just this flat line here. Okay. If you want to determine how many an individual firm should sell, what quantity they should actually sell, that will be determined by their marginal cost. If their marginal cost exceeds this line here, their marginal revenue, then it doesn't make sense for them to sell anymore. So in this example here, we can see a marginal curve which is a low price at the beginning and then goes up. But once it goes past this flat line here, that will determine the quantity that the individual firm will sell. So let's take the example again of cabbages. A farmer sells as many cabbages as they want into the market without shifting the price at all, but their costs will vary. Perhaps at the start it's reasonably cheap for them to produce the cabbages, but to produce more and more cabbages, they might need to start having more complex systems like hydroponics or build new infrastructure, and the marginal costs go up. So for that example of cabbages, it is the marginal cost that will determine the quantity that that firm will sell, because to the firm, it is an example of perfectly elastic demand. The price does not change no matter how much they sell. So here we see those two curves side by side. On the left here, we see the supply curve and the demand curve for the industry as a whole. So for the industry as a whole, more cabbages being produced would be produced at a higher price, but fewer cabbages would be demanded at a higher price. And eventually, what will be established typically would be the equilibrium quantity and price. So the quantity where the amount demanded is equal to the amount supplied, and that will determine the industry's price, the market price. For an individual firm, the amount that they're producing is insignificant compared to the total market, so their price will essentially be fixed, and the amount that they will produce or output will be determined by their marginal costs. If their marginal costs exceed their marginal revenue, which is just set by this fixed price here, it's just a horizontal line, then it's not worth producing anymore, because it's going to cost them more for each additional unit than they make from each additional unit. So just as this marginal curve cuts this marginal revenue, which is a flat line at the market price here, at the equilibrium price, just at that point, that will determine the quantity produced by that individual firm. So to summarize the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, okay, if it meets these characteristics, if it has these characteristics, we would call it a perfectly competitive market. Okay, there are many sellers. Okay, here it says hundreds or thousands, so the individual firm is small compared to the market as a whole. Yeah, each seller is assumed to have identical costs, so they're all selling essentially the same sort of thing. They have identical costs. Each firm has a homogeneous product. That means the products that they sell are the same. So cabbages are cabbages, essentially. Yeah. There are low barriers to entry. It's not a very expensive market to enter. That means that you can have many different firms competing in that marketplace. The firms in a perfectly competitive market will be price takers. They have to accept the equilibrium price, and they as firms have little or no control over what that price is. It is determined by the equilibrium price, the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve for the industry as a whole. So the market price determines the firm's demand curve. So it will be perfectly elastic, meaning it will be flat horizontal curve. Okay, the average revenue and the marginal revenue will also just be this flat curve. Okay, the demand for the product in the market is perfectly elastic. That is this flat horizontal demand curve. So firms in perfectly competitive markets will earn no economic profits in the long run. Okay, and that is because there's no barrier to entry. Economic profits will be competed away by other entrants into the market. Okay, they can make short-run profits, but they won't make economic profits in the long run. Remember that an economic profit includes the opportunity cost. Okay, so they will not make any more money than they would doing something else. So remember, as we've discussed, a firm in a perfectly competitive market, their marginal revenue, which is defined as being the change in their total revenue divided by the change in the quantity, or in other words, how much extra revenue do they gain for the next unit that they sell, that's the marginal revenue, it is a constant. It is simply set by the price, the equilibrium price of the market. Okay? That's because the firm is a price taker. They must take the price from the market. Okay? That's equal to the demand curve as well. Okay, so let's build up these curves again for the individual firm. We'll start with the demand curve. Remember that it is perfectly elastic. From the point of view of the individual firm, the price doesn't change no matter what quantity they produce. Okay? In other words, the firm has no ability to affect the price. It is a fixed price set by the market as a whole. Now let's add to that graph the marginal cost curve. That's this graph here. Okay? And if we have increasing marginal costs, as the quantity increases, the cost of each additional unit will increase. The marginal principle tells us that the optimal point for this particular firm is where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. And we've said previously that the marginal revenue will be the same as the demand curve. It's just a horizontal line at the market price. Okay, so where these two intersect will be the logical place for the firm to produce. That is because it doesn't make any sense for the firm to produce an additional unit if the cost of that unit is higher than the revenue generated for that unit. This is the quantity that will achieve the maximum profit for this particular firm. Okay, now let's add to that graph the average total costs. And remember that the average total costs will be at a minimum where the marginal costs crosses it. We discussed that in the previous lesson. Okay? Okay, now if this graph actually represents the total economic costs for a perfectly a market represented characterized by perfect competition, we would actually expect there to be a zero economic profit. That is to say that the average total cost at this point here will equal to the revenue, the marginal revenue at this point. So there will be a zero economic profit if that is the case. Okay. So the economic profit, if it is equal to the revenue minus the cost on this graph, is there an economic profit being earned by the firm represented by this graph at this price? Okay, and we're saying no, there is no economic profit being earned at this price. And that's on this graph where the average total cost at the quantity produced is equal to the marginal revenue at that quantity. Okay. Is this firm breaking even? Yes, it's not making a loss, it's not making a profit, it's breaking even. Okay, so when we say breaking even in this context, we're talking about a zero economic profit. The firm could be making an accounting profit, so it could be making money every month or every year. But if we account for the opportunity cost, if we subtract the opportunity cost, it will end up making zero economic profit. And that's because we're in a situation of perfect competition. And if it were profitable in terms of economic profit, more other firms would enter into the market, leading to a lower price. So ultimately, in perfect competition, we expect zero economic profit. Okay, so this is the type of graph we expect to see when there's perfect competition in the long run. Okay, so in the long run, that means that there's enough time for other firms to enter into the market and compete away any economic profit that a firm could be making. Yeah, but in the short run, it is possible for a firm to make economic profit. Okay, so let's say we had this situation characterized by this graph, and a firm is breaking even, meaning that it is covering all of its explicit costs and its implicit costs, and it's making a zero economic profit. So it is making an accounting profit, but just enough to repay the entrepreneur for his time and money invested in the business. Okay, what would have to change for this firm to earn economic profit? Okay. Well, if there were an increase in the demand in that market, that means a shift from this D1 demand curve to this D2 demand curve. That would lead to a higher equilibrium price in the marketplace. Okay, and if there were a higher equilibrium price, then each individual firm in the market would experience a new price. Okay, this means with this new higher price, they could make an economic profit. Okay, but if the firms, the individual firms in this market were making an economic profit, what would the effect be given that there are no barriers to entry? Okay, no barriers to entry means that anyone can set up a new firm and start trading in this market.